Hi. So I watched The American Factory for my documentary this week, and I'm going to jump right in and start talking about the examples of working poor that I saw exhibited throughout the documentary. So the first one was kind of obviously the biggest thing when regarding working poor was just the fact that these people, with their new positions at this factory, they did not have the ability to afford housing. A lot of them had lost their homes or their apartments and just had to move in with family or find something in a very low income area, which is really hard to do. And so they just, even though they had jobs and were working full 40 hours a week, they were not able to afford housing. Another example that a lady gave was that prior to working at this new factory, at her old job, she would have been able to, if her kid asked for gym shoes, she could just go and buy him gym shoes and not think twice about it. Where now she just doesn't have that income to be able to make that happen just at the drop of a hat. So just little examples like that were kind of dropped throughout, but the biggest one that was talked about consistently for almost all of the employees that were interviewed was the fact that they could no longer afford housing. The next kind of example that I saw of working poor was safety was talked about a lot. And with this new factory that had opened, they really weren't concerned about employee safety. That was something that was heavily talked about, was people had previously worked for their employer at the same factory for decades and never had a workplace injury. And after a few months of working for this new one, they had workplace injuries. Some had to have surgery, some required like time off of work. They were in crutches with casts and things like that just because of the lack of safety policies that were being put in place. And not only just not being put in place, but the fact that this new company was blatantly disregarding things that should not have been. And I think that often kind of comes with the territory of these jobs that do keep people working poor. There isn't usually that drive behind keeping their employees safe, because a lot of times when they're paying their employees so poorly that their employees can't afford to sustain their life, it does come with that, like the thought that their employees are just expendable, so they just don't really need to think about their safety. I know there's a lot of jobs out there that pay really well and still don't think about their employees' safety, but I think that is something that really does come with those lower wage jobs. And then the last thing that I noticed was how much discrimination the Americans really got from these Chinese workers that came over to train them. There was a lot of comments made about Americans being overconfident and they're just very lazy. And at one point there was a conversation between supervisors about how Americans were really chatty, and the only way to stop that would be to put duct tape over their mouths, which they obviously couldn't do. And so just like comments like that consistently throughout about just how like righteous and just lazy Americans were. And so they just really, there was that kind of air with that. And I do again think that's something that does often come from a lot of these lower wage jobs. There is a lot of discrimination, whether it be from the public or supervisors or higher ups, whoever. I do think that discrimination is something that oftentimes does accompany that. Throughout the entire documentary, one thing that was just kind of obviously a huge thing that stood out to me was the contrast in the Chinese and Americans' work culture. So one thing that was brought up was the length of days that the Chinese worked versus the Americans. The Chinese would work 12-hour plus days, where the Americans only wanted to work 8-hour days. We don't want to work overtime, where in China they were working Saturdays and it was mandatory overtime, and they just didn't understand we should just come in and work on Saturdays. They just didn't understand why Americans wouldn't want to do that. And then the wages, at one point, one lady mentioned that previously when she worked at the GM factory, she was making like $29 an hour, and now she's making $12, just huge differences between the two. And then many employees, like I said, at the GM factory, they were comfortably in the middle class, where now they are in that lower class because they were making 12 or they're making 29 something an hour at GM. Now they're making 12 something with this new Foyer factory. So, you know, it just going from that middle to lower class. And then I think while many people were at GM, like I said, they were there for decades. So they really kind of, that was an achievement for them. So I think that they would kind of identify that with being an achieved status. Where now with this new position where they're making very little money, I think they would more identify with kind of an ascribed status of that lower socioeconomic kind of position that they're in. I don't think they would consider this position anymore an achieved status. And then I think the biggest thing that like could potentially be changed is just the corporate greed, really. This, you know, factory owner, he was a billionaire. They mentioned that a lot, but yet he was paying these people dirt, just nothing. There was no safety, and it wasn't because they didn't have the money to do so. It was just because they were so concerned about that bottom dollar. And I think that's something that really does need to be changed. So that's a little bit about the American Factory. One thing that I did find really, just to end on a good note, I really did enjoy it kind of throughout how many people were willing to adapt each other's cultures, whether it was the Chinese employees kind of taking some things from the American culture and really embracing it, or vice versa. That was really just like fun to watch and unique, that even though they were all in these positions, they were still able to find some joy and get to find some exciting things to take from one another. So yeah, bye.